This is the Education Exchange with Paul Peterson. I am the director of the program on education policy and governance at Harvard University and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. Thank you for joining us. Universities are increasingly perceived as ideologically biased, politically progressive, extremist institutions. Student demonstrations, campus publications, interviews with activists document the claims. Are they really true? Are students that extreme? Do they lean to the left? If they do lean to the left, is that because of what they learned on the campus, or were they already pulled to the left by forces before they ever arrived? Well, new light is being shed on these questions by a research team led by Paola Sapienza, senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. Although the study she and her colleagues are undertaking is still in progress, she has recently presented some of her key findings at a seminar at Hoover, and she's generously agreed to share her results with you, our listeners, on the Education Exchange. So thank you, Paola, for joining me on the Education
Thank
Exchange.
you for having me here, Paul.
Well, so Paola, let me ask you, well, we'll get to your methods. I know academics always care more about methods than anything else, but we'll get to that. But our listeners really want to know is, what's the answer to that big question? Are universities pulling students to the left?
It's complicated. I would say yes, but not that much. And let me explain. So we look at data that start in 1969 and then all the way to 2019. And so what you see is that the peak of left-leaning among students, so this is the average political view, is really at the at the beginning of 1970. This is the time of Vietnam War. We know that there was a lot of unrest on campus. Then in the 80s, it went down, and then now has reemerged as moving more to the left.
Well, what's so interesting about your study is that you have this trend over time. We're able to look at what's happened over many, many years, and that's far more interesting than knowing what the little fact is this afternoon. But tell me, where do you get this information?
So the data come from a survey that has been run by Harry over time. And what is interesting about the data is that they come at two moments in the life of the student to answer your question about university moving students to the left. The first time is before the students set foot on campus. So in some way, what the survey gives us is the political view of the students before they are treated by the universities. And it gives us a sense of where this particular group of youth, of course a selective one because not everyone goes to college, is thinking in terms of political views. And then for a subgroup of them, they get re-interviewed during their senior years. And so we can actually see the difference for the same individual before and after. And we can answer the question, are the university moving them more to the left? On average, the answer is yes. So
what is your measure of leftistness?
Okay, so the answer, that's a very good question. The question is how you define yourself in terms of political ideology, and the options the students can answer are 5: very conservative, middle of the road, liberal, and very liberal. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the majority of the students that reach campus are middle of the road.
So when they're freshmen, as they arrive on the scene, they say sort of number 3 on this list, right?
Right, yeah.
So
the majority
they're neither fish nor fowl, right?
Right. And then it's interesting also to know that at exit, the one that are re-interviewed, 56% of them don't change ideology. coming
So a
out.
majority don't change at all. They say the same thing as a senior that they said as a first-year student.
Right. But a minority change a lot. So it's always complicated, right? Because we're always looking at, what is the punchline? In reality, is a little bit more mixed than we want to know. If you think about that, the majority of the students are centrist. We have also, if you can think about the extreme views, the extreme.
Well, yes, because that's another topic, as I mentioned in the openings. The perception out there by many ordinary people is that the campuses are full of extremists. So how many are these students are extremists?
Very few, I have to say. Probably they're very vocal, and that's why we think that there are many, but the very conservative and very liberal is actually the smallest category, less than 2% on each side. With a slight uptick over time, and we're talking about going from 1.8% to 2.1%, in the more liberal. So on average, yes, we see this movement to the left, which, by the way, really is very similar to what's happening in the overall country, especially if we survey youth, so those between 18 and 24, in standard generalized surveys where the same question is asked, we find that there is a huge overlap between our incoming students and youth in the U.S.
So when
in
first-year
general.
students arrive on the campus, they're not much different from kids the same age all over the country, whether or not they're going to college.
Right. It's important, though, to keep in mind that kids are more liberal than older people,
Well,
right?
they're not paying taxes yet.
Exactly. That's the old say, right? If you're not liberal when you're youth, you don't have a soul, and then
Yes,
later,
then you don't have a brain. So.
exactly.
So yes, so you're saying if you looked at them compared to all Americans, they would look sort of more liberal. But if you look at them as compared to other people the same age, whether or not they go to college, they're about the same.
That's correct.
Now, is that changed at all over time? Has the whole country moved in the same way that you just described?
If we examine the youth as a block, they moved in a similar way. So they became more conservative in the period that goes from the 70s to the 80s, with 1980, the year in which in the country there were as many young people that were conservative and as many that were liberal. So they were really exactly in the middle on average. And then it started going up, and it really picks up again 2005 and later. So the last 15 years, we see an uptick. These averages, though, they mask lots of heterogeneity across various demographic. And as you know, demographic has changed a lot in college.
Yes. Well, tell me how much of this liberalness or conservativeness is driven by demographics. Do you know whether or not I'm a conservative just by looking at a person and saying, oh, well, that person is a certain color and a certain gender, and I know whether or not how they think?
Yes, there are a number of things that are important. Gender is an important one. Women are more liberal, and they become more liberal over time. Men have become more conservative, and that really is becoming a bigger divide over time. And this is among the youth. We're focusing on them. We also have a difference in racial and ethnicity across people. We have that white are generally more conservative, and minorities, being Hispanic, and Black, they tend to be more liberal. the other biggest divide is religion. And it's important to understand how, in general, Protestant and Catholic religions are more conservative. Jewish religion tend to be more liberal. And then, of course, no religion has a biggest load on being liberal. Now, it's important to keep in mind that this has always been more or less this type of divide. But what has happened over time is that we're seeing way more kids not declaring any specific religion. So the college demographic has also changed. Has changed in terms of gender, has changed in terms of ethnicity, and has also changed in terms of the religion composition. And so partially all these effects are loading on very similar characteristics, but the characteristics have changed over time. The biggest one probably being religion that has changed dramatically. If you look at the 70s or now, the composition of religious attitude on campus are very, very different than in the past.
So there's not that big a difference between Protestants and Catholics. Is that what I heard you say?
Yeah, they tend to be conservative on both of them.
Both of them tend, and they're quite distinct from those who say they have no religion at all. Or,
right.
Yeah.
And actually, over time, and I wonder whether this is an interesting meaning, over time, being Protestant or Catholic loads even more on being conservative. I think one potential interpretation is that at a time in which religion is not as important as it used to be, being religious or a specific type of religious gives a much stronger identity feeling, and so it is associated with stronger views. While in the past, maybe everyone was religious, but religion was not such a big identity.
So here's a question that I don't know if you can really answer this with your data, but maybe people aren't becoming extreme, but they're becoming more sure or more committed to being a conservative or a liberal. So they may not be out on the fringes, but they may be more intense. Is there any possibility that could explain the greater sense of conflict that we are talking about?
I don't know. I don't know that we can answer with the data. What we did is the following exercise that you may find interesting. So we did a matrix of entry and exit. So imagine that you put everyone into a structure in which you know whether they are entering as a very conservative or middle of the road, and then you try to see how they exit. So what's going to happen is, and this is maybe consistent with you, is that the main diagonal of this transition matrix is going to be where there is the larger percentage of people. People tend to stick with what they have more than moving. However, this is more so among the liberal and less so among the conservative on campus. In other words, campus moves conservative more toward, generally speaking, middle of the road, so slightly more to the left, but not very left. The liberals tend to be stickier over time, and they may be more convinced about their opinion. And then the middle of the road, people, the majority still stay where they are, but if anything, they tend to move one step to the left, so they tend to go to liberal. So there is a lot of movement, but it's still to keep in mind that the majority stay where they are, but it's more likely that more liberal people stay where they are.
So we recognize that there are these demographic characteristics and other background factors like religion, but is that the full story, or is there something more that's happening in terms of both arriving at the campus in a more liberal direction and changing over time? Or is it just these demographics that explain it all?
One interesting thing that I think the listener would be intrigued to hear is the following. We were actually wondering whether there was some sorting into universities, because you hear a lot that people have these very strong views and then they sort, and then you have this view of America in general that is where you have concentration of people of one type versus others. And we try to look at polarization within college and across colleges. And so what polarization is, we were trying to figure out whether specific colleges were attracting a specific type of students. And what we find is that polarization is within college. In other words, there is a lot of different views in every single college. So we are here at Stanford. You're going to probably find every type of person. You don't find that Stanford attract one type of students. There is some polarization across colleges over time, but it's very minimal. So that's one interesting fact. The other thing that we try to ask was the following is, does it matter the place you come from? We asked this in many different ways, because remember, one of the big debate in the literature and in the press is, are the college recruiting the wrong students and so forth? Where do they go to recruit? And so we try to look at a number of things. One is, does it matter in any way whether the students who come with more liberal views experience some economic downturn specifically to their areas and so on? And none of the economic conditions around them seem to matter. What it tends to matter, though, a bit more over time is the percentage of people voting for Democrats or Republican, basically the voting share in the electoral district where they come from. And what we find strongly is that this is a predictor of the student, the percentage of Democratic vote share is a predictor of a student being more liberal. What does it tell you this? I think what it tells you is that in the past, if you selected a student from an area where maybe there were a bit more votes to the Democrats, you can predict whether the students would turn one way or the other. Now, maybe these areas are becoming more homogeneous, and so that is becoming a stronger predictor of the student being a liberal.
Let me ask that at a larger level. People think that it makes a big difference what region you come from. The coasts are liberal and flyover country in the South, those are more conservative spaces. Would you say that you find more conservative youth in the South and the Midwest than on the coasts?
In college, because, we didn't look at the zip code of origin, but what we did was the following, was slightly different exercise. We look at private, and especially private elite, and public institution. And what we find there is a big divide. In other words, the institution where the students show up as more liberal are more likely to be the private elite institution vis-a-vis the public institution. Now, we have public institution in every state, so I don't know that I can tell you. We didn't check whether it was specific of various states, and they rotate over time. So maybe the survey would not be able to scientifically allow us to check that. But certainly, what we see is that there is a difference in terms of selectivity of the institution.
The great state universities are in the Midwest and the South. There's Texas and there's Alabama and there's Ohio and there's Michigan and Wisconsin and so forth. And the great private institutions are on the coast, whether it's Harvard or Stanford or Yale or Princeton or whatever. So It
So
may
that
overlap.
could be, yeah.
But it's interesting to see, why do you think there's been a difference between the private and the state sectors?
So that's a really big question. I mean, it's not that they don't have the same trend, but it's obviously there is a big difference in terms of level. And I think one potential explanation, we're not able to at this moment to be sure about that, is that if you think about the interest in elite institution has become more and more coming from the Democratic Party in general. And so if you look at in general, survey that asked the question, how much do you trust academic institution? While 20 years ago, you would see a very similar answer from Democrat and Republican, you now see a very different answer from the trust from the Republican side has gone down dramatically. So the question is, to what extent the view that institutions are, that these higher education institutions are important is affecting who goes, who applies to certain type of institution, and thinks that it's very, very important to end up in a very elite rather than going to, the local public institution. So that could be a selection effect that is entirely driven by the view of what the institution will do to, for my kids, and maybe the parents suggest to their children to apply in one place versus the other. That's one possibility. The second possibility is where is recruiting of elite students coming from. We know that is disproportionately coming from suburban, wealthy neighborhood that generally have a higher electoral share among the Democrats. And that's exactly what we find, is that that variable is a predictor that the students would be more liberal. And so that's maybe also a reason. Maybe the public institution, they recruit more rural students that come from a very different electoral district, and that will explain. This is not about the college modifying the view of the students. It's much more the colleging, the college loading and selecting students that come from certain parts of the country.
Well, Paola, you're sort of reassuring. A lot of people get very excited when this topic comes up, but my sense is that you're telling me not to worry too much, that what's been happening on our campuses is much less dramatic than anything that the press is covering and making a big story out of, or that the politicians are getting themselves worked up about. Am I correct in drawing that conclusion?
I would say, I mean, the glass is always half full and half empty, but let's put it in this way. So suppose that I put the scale very conservative at -2 and very liberal at +2. So a middle of the road is 0. What's the average of the incoming students today? Is 0.3. So it's very close to middle of the road. Now, it's much higher than what it was in the 80s. But what it was telling us is that, and this comes from the fact that the majority of the students are middle of the road. I think what our data suggest, combined with what we hear from campus, is that there are some very vocal activists on campus. But we should seriously study what the average student does when he's on campus. And my optimism comes from the fact that maybe this is really a very loud minority. And if we can teach them how to converse in a civic way to the rest of the students, I think it's upon us, academics, to do that. This is not a big crowd to face. It's just a minority of the students on campus.
Well, thank you very much. It's a so insightful analysis, so informative. There's so much information in your report. I'm really looking forward to the day when that's going to be generally available. And thank you for the sneak peek that you have provided for our listeners.
Thank you so much, Paul. It was great to be here.
I have been speaking with Paola Sapienza. She's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. I'm Paul Peterson. This is the Education Exchange. Please join me for a new Education Exchange podcast released on the Education Next website and the Hoover Institution website every Monday at noon Eastern Time.